with the middle microscope, because that will take you to the basic pathogenesis for parasitic infection. So, for all three lectures that we have covered, three topics that we have covered in the last unit, just want you to be informed that I have not gone in detail into pathogenesis, especially related to immunology of how does immune system deal with a virus, how does the immune system deal with a fungi, and how does the immune system deal with the parasites. So this is your responsibility to go back into your general microbiology lectures that were done in the beginning first week and review that. And they will also be included obviously in the pathogenesis of these three microorganisms. I'll just kind of summarize a couple of them. Now, if you remember, we did go through parasite. By definition, is an organism that lives on or in the host, and basically is totally dependent for all his metabolism, and basically we actually pay for it. It's at our expense. There are many different classifications. If you read that chapter that we discussed earlier, there are three main classes that cause human disease. But of course, there are many other classes that would cause animal disease, and I'm going to talk about briefly some of those overlapping parasites that are of interest because we come in contact with animals, we eat their meat, pets, farms, and other places where occupational problems that we may go through. Protozoa, helminths, and ectoparasites. Just like a very broad classification of some of the parasites, they are there. Okay, now again, protozoa. Most of you who've done biology, there were quite a few. How many of you did biology before coming to this school? Biology, journal biology. Everybody, right? So no need for me to go through that. And that's a basic. That's a basic biology that it's a one-cell organism, and you do all those experiments. And basically, all you need to know for this class purpose is that most of the protozoa live in human intestine, and typical transmission is fecal-oral route, and the contaminated water and food are responsible for that. There is person-to-person contact. And also remember, there are some protozoa that also live in our blood or tissues. And basically, the most important, though it's not directly concerned with us in U.S., but it's malaria. For many of us who visit those countries where the incidence is high, we still are struggling to fight malaria. There's no vaccine available as of today. So these are all protozoa that can live in your intestine, in your blood, and your tissues. All three different forms of available tissues are inhabited by protozoa. Now, again, I will not go in detail. You know that we normally do classify protozoa based upon their mode of movement. So they may have a flagella, they may have a cilia, and some of them also have different stages of maturation. So a lot of classifications are done based upon that, and that will give you an idea as to what kind of cycle, the reproductive cycle, these protozoa go through. The second important parasite are helminths, and they are large, multicellular, and basically these are one of those microorganisms. Well, we call them microorganisms. They're not microorganisms, classified in microbiology though, but they can be visible to the naked eye, especially in their adult stages. But as far as their, some of the cyst forms, some of the egg forms, of course, it's difficult for us to see with the naked eye. And they can be either free-living or parasitic. In adult form, they cannot multiply in human. That's another thing that you have to keep in mind for most of the helminths. Okay, again, as far as their classification is concerned, they are human parasites. We usually classify them to three major forms. Number one, flatworms, and these include flukes, and tapeworms. These are like, if you see them, there are pictures available in your book. I didn't really put them in this lecture, but you can see they are flat, and they include flukes and tapeworms. The second type of helminths are thorny headworms. They actually reside in our gastrointestinal tract. Whenever we talk of parasites, remember they are either going to live on our tissues, on our blood, or intestines. These are the three major parts of the human body that most of the parasites live. Now, these are thorny headworms, and the typical is acanthocephalins. They are there, and they basically are somewhere between cestodes and nematodes. And finally, we have roundworms, and they can again reside in gastrointestinal tract, blood and lymphatic system, or even subcutaneous tissue. And their larval stage is important because they can penetrate different parts of our tissue. Remember one of the slides that showed you, where the worms were coming out of a person's nose, or sometimes they can even dislodge into hearts as well. So you can see once they can start growing, especially in animals. Many times, especially pet dogs, they die because these actually go into mature form and kind of, form a convoluted loop and block. And that happens in humans as well. The most common thing that you'll see is intestinal obstruction. So they will find some kind of blockage, and then of course no food can be passed, no air or gas will be passed. So you have something we call in medicine as obstipation. There's one thing called constipation, another thing called obstipation. And constipation is that the person is able to pass feces, cannot pass feces, but he's able to pass flatus. But in obstipation, nothing passes by. So it's like absolute, complete blockage. And that actually is a surgical emergency. That really has to be operated upon. Okay. Now, leeches, basically, they sometimes are included as segmented worms, but they are not typical parasites, but of course, they are important, not in terms of causing disease as well, because some of the leeches, they think that they release some kind of, they are usually anticoagulants, and people use it as a treatment as well. So in many cultures, many places in the world, people apply leeches on the body, and they think it's going to take all the dirty blood or contaminated blood out. But obviously, there are scientific reasons that we do treat them. We treat human beings with leeches, and they usually are anticoagulants, and they have a way of kind of injecting those anticoagulants into our system. Okay, so we will not go in detail, but they are considered as segmented worms called Annelids. Now, third is ectoparasites, and actually again, these basically are broad parasites that include blood-sucking arthropods. So basically, these are, for most of the diseases that we'll study today, we basically will consider mosquitoes in there. But they actually can refer to quite a few organisms like ticks, fleas, flies, and mites. And most of these, organism will burrow or attach on our skin and remain there for relatively long periods of time, and they can actually act as a vector. So vector is something that's between, for example, from animal to human beings, you need an intermediary, like a go-between. So they act as a vector. They're going to help carry, whatever bacteria or viruses or parasites from one to another. And typical example, of course, was, rat, flea, and we talked about plague. Basically, rats got infected, and they were flea, biting on the rats, and then coming and biting human beings as well. So there's a typical vector transmission that is important, and they're all different kinds. So there are tick-borne diseases, flea-borne diseases, lice-borne diseases, and mice-borne diseases, and there are a lot of chapters, and I don't think we'll have time in this class to cover that. Hopefully some of the DAS courses will cover that. And again, the problem with parasitology is that quite a few parasites are not clinically important to this part of the world. So traditionally they've been kind of ignored, unless and until you want to practice in those areas. farm area, Texas, and other places where the incidence of diseases by tick or flea or lice or mite are very common. So you'll see quite a few patients coming up and asking for advice and help. The most important thing that you have to understand is that though we are not going to study them in this class, but they are very important and they do cause tremendous morbidity and mortality. The diseases caused by these vectors are important. So it doesn't mean that they are unimportant, it's just because there are many of them and there are too many things to remember, too many names of them, and too many treatment modules available. So we kind of, left it aside not to really go in detail for this course. But morbidity and mortality is quite high from these, and actually malaria is one of them. So if you go to WHO, you'll see, or even CDC website, you will see hundreds of pages giving explanation or details of the symptoms, signs, lab diagnosis, and treatment options available for parasitic infections. Okay, now most of the time when we talk of parasitic infections, we basically are talking about the burden, that actually comes on health industry, and basically the prevalence and incidence. These are an important thing. But keep in mind that basically it's high in tropics and subtropics and more temperate climates. Malaria remains number one globally as we talk of tuberculosis, but malaria is one of the major killers in different parts of the world. And you can see kills approximately 1 million people each year. Unfortunately, most of them young children, and then again sub-Saharan Africa. There, if you remember, we talked about AIDS as well, very common in that part of the world. And many a time it's because of economy, because of poverty, because of these people not being able to meet the basic sanitary requirements, or basically lack of medicine there, and so on and so forth. So basically this is more or less to do with their economy as compared to treatment modules. Malaria, it is a notifiable or reportable disease in this country. So if I'm going to diagnose a person that is suffering from malaria, so no medicine will be available. The pharmacists don't really carry medicine for malaria, but you have to notify it and take permission for that. Let's move. Now, there's another topic that CDC and WHO are talking about. Again, you can see that myself I'm saying that we neglect these parasitic diseases, and many times we don't treat them. I personally, I thought that it's available for P1, but I was told that the elective I'm going to offer, the current topics in infectious diseases only for P2. So there are some electives. I think Dr. Allison will tell you. I don't really remember the exact amount of credit hours, but I think I can recall you have to have 10 to 12 credit hours of elective courses before you graduate. And these electives are to be offered to you in P2. So current topics of infectious diseases and maybe current topics in tropical diseases will either be offered by me or one of our colleagues, infectious disease specialists. But you really have to complete at least 10 to 12 hours of elective courses to graduate. And they usually are offered, I think, in fall. Anyway, the neglected tropical diseases, NTDs, don't confuse that with STDs. Those are usually a very easy distractor for me to put in. STDs and NTDs. We actually didn't pay attention unless we found out that there are quite a few diseases caused by filaria, onchocerciasis, and guinea worm. And there are incidences over here as well that they think that quite a few people basically not only are morbid, but actually they die. And you can see 500,000 people annually, largely in rural areas or low-income countries. That's like a WHO statistics again. But the most important thing you have to remember is that all these kind of infectious diseases are important, especially when we talk of people or children in a confined area like schools and daycare centers and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, many of these parasitic infections are also linked with the performance of the students. For example, they can go and affect your central nervous system. And they can basically retard growth of the children. They can impair cognitive skill, and it actually places a lot of economic burden on those countries. So unfortunately, those countries, they are at a poverty level, and then on top of that, you have these parasitic diseases. So it takes another toll because it's going to affect school children, young adults, and basically, compromise not only their immune system but also compromise their mental capabilities, like cognitive skills. So that's very important. That's why now they are beginning to think that we should not neglect them. So these, well, unfortunately, WHO does have a program, neglected tropical diseases, to basically help, especially those African countries where there are a lot of problems there. How many of you come from African countries and want to go back once they have their pharmacy degrees? Because we usually come in interviews and people tell us, we come from those countries and this is our ambitions that go back and help. I hope you do. Easier said than done. Okay. All right. Now, parasitic infection in developed countries. What do we have in terms of U.S.? That's actually the major impact that we have. The most common Trichomonas are the most common parasitic infection, and basically this is also one of the commonest sexual transmissible diseases as well. Remember, we did some of the viral diseases, some of the bacterial diseases. Out of the parasitic diseases, Trichomonas are important. You can see in U.S. alone, we have 7.4 million cases per year. That's a very high incidence. It's actually 8 times higher than malaria. Malaria is for the whole U.S. We have a very high incidence for this Trichomonas. Okay, then again, diarrhea and Tryptosporidium, they are also very high. You can see 2 million for diarrhea and about 300,000 annually for Tryptosporidium. And again, the most important thing for Tryptosporidium is that they actually are the frequent cause of infection in recreational water-related diseases. So if you go, whatever, Disneyland, this land, and all those SeaWorld, you're not going to jump into water in SeaWorld, but those places where there is water available for recreation and children are there, so they have to make sure that that water is not contaminated with Tryptosporidium, because there's always outbreaks, multiple outbreaks each year. So this is their responsibility, and you can ask for the license and certificate. The other important thing in this country, especially deaths due to foodborne illnesses, again, very important, big food industry. A lot of us, come from different cultures, different places, so there's a huge diversity in terms of amount of food available, packaged food, and so on and so forth. And you can see there are 1.5 million new cases of Toxoplasma infections. That's again very important. And Toxoplasma is important because this is one of those parasitic diseases that affects eye. So you may have ocular problems if you suffer, and again it's very common in veterinary diseases as well. Because there's another thing, I'll just briefly touch upon that, zoonotic diseases. So these are those diseases that if you are keeping a pet and you're not taking that pet to the vet, and you're not really updating all those health care rules and regulations, there are chances that you may get that infection from your domesticated animals. Okay. As far as CDC is concerned, and I want you to go and do a little bit of research on that as well. There's a topic on parasites and health. So basically, broad classification, I personally usually like that and teach that as well, because we just have to cover parasitology in two lectures. So very, very broad overview of that. Parasites of the intestinal tract, obviously they're going to cause diarrhea. bloodborne parasites, again, will cause a lot of diseases like malaria. And then we have parasites found in other sites like lungs, kidneys, CNS, and many different places. So it's unfortunate that just when we thought that microbiology is over, so imagine the challenge we have from bacteria, viruses, and fungi, and then still there is a different world altogether, parasites. They are out there to cause problems to us, right? So this is that's what they say, is it a human world or is it a microbial world? And it comes to be that there are more microbes than the human beings, even on one human, even as your normal flora. So you have more microorganisms than the cells that you have on your body. So you have to have a very strong natural immunity or patent immune system to fight that. Okay, another important thing I want you to keep in mind is that when we talk of parasite, basically we are talking about this population of the community. They unfortunately happen to be the primary targets. I don't know why. We'll talk about that in a while. Infections with a number of parasites can lead to special consequences for women because of childbearing. That's number one. Because of childbearing, because of sexual transmissible diseases, very high incidence. So these two major things will keep their level of incidence of parasitic disease very high. And that I'm talking about the WHO criteria for the world, and then again for US as well. Okay, Toxoplasma gondii, you can see from here, a parasite found in undercooked meat. That's another thing. Food microbiology actually is taught separately, but what we are concerned in this lecture today is that, remember, that some things you may not take it lightly. For example, uncooked meat. That's another thing. I'm pretty sure in some of the cultures, I myself went to a party and found it's too raw a meat. So they say, well, they want to taste the meat. So there are people over there, they take raw meat. You know, and I don't want to say that some of the cultures and even want to go for blood plus meat. So that's their favorite dish. So there are practices in people, but you have to make sure that it's not infected with Toxoplasma gondii. Then again, cat feces is important because those who have pets, they have to be careful. Soil and untreated water. The problem with Toxoplasma gondii is that it's going to cause severe brain and eye disorders, especially if pregnant women come in contact with it, because it's going to be transmitted to the fetus. That's where the emphasis stands, that women and parasites. So that's important because they are bearing children and they have fetuses and they can easily fall prey to these kind of infections. Trichomonas vaginalis, as the name suggests, very common, again, one of the commonest sexual transmissible diseases. I didn't have time this year, but I did have time last year to discuss the whole detail of that. Hopefully we'll do with the current topics in STDs as an elective. The problem with STDs, why is a big problem, why do we care, why should we care? Because many a time these problems, no matter how trivial, they are linked with HIV. So they increase your chances of susceptibility to human immunodeficiency virus. Number one, because of the sexual preferences that you are taking. Number two, because all these sexual transmissible diseases basically make you susceptible and decrease your immunity or provide all those things which are counted as high-risk factors. So Trichomonas are important. The second important thing related to women again is malaria in pregnant women, a very high risk of miscarriage and low birth weight, and very important, of course, in Africa, where there is a very high infant mortality rate and a lot of problems, especially in the children. So if these women are suffering from malaria while they are pregnant, then again there is a challenge that they may abort, or they may have some other problem. The most important problem other than this is basically, come in a while, is anemia. Because many of these parasites, they feed at your blood, especially your red blood cells. So there's again one of the very commonest causes of anemia. And anemia can, of course, lead to many other disorders as well. So, talking about parasites that cause diarrhea, usually women with young children and children in daycare center. Again, diarrhea is very common, cryptosporidium is very common, and then other problems, pinworms, basically very common, especially Enterobius vermicularis, that cause anal itching in young children, very common even in this country, and then it can be easily spread out to the rest of the groups. Okay, Chagas disease is important, especially in this country, because again, for the same reason, it can be transmitted from a pregnant woman to the developing fetus. Remember, this is another category. I just want you to make a list of your own, and that's one of the important questions: is what are the diseases that can be transmitted? The parasitic disease that can be transmitted from the mother to the fetus, for example, because that's the major concern that we have. And then it may lead to heart and brain infection, and then again some of the chronic disorders the child may have in future. So Trypanosoma cruzi is important. It actually is a vector-borne parasitic illness, very common in Central and South America, and again importance in relation to women and pregnant women especially. Sorry? I'll just come to that in a while. Anemia in pregnant women. That's another thing, remember. There are many causes of anemia in pregnant women. A very broad kind of a group of medical disorder that may have bacteria, viruses, and whatnot. Even food habits, anorexia nervosa. There's a list of that. But what you need to remember is that especially hookworm infestation, there's infection. That's another thing. If you have anemia in pregnant women, you want to make sure that she doesn't have hookworm infection, because that can basically lead to low infant birth rate, impaired milk production, and a higher risk of mortality for both the mother and the infant. So that's another thing. And remember, all of these tests are normally done in routine antenatal care. So you have this antenatal care and the prenatal clinics. So usually check all these pregnant women for all these different kind of parasitic diseases. And then again, anemia can also be caused by malaria, because if you remember, I'm not going to go in detail, Plasmodium falciparum, there's a causative agent of malaria, or even vivax. They are going to reside in your red blood cell, and they are going to kill the red blood cell. So that's again one of the commonest causes of anemia, shortness of breath, and many other problems that these especially pregnant women go through. So that remains a challenge, anemia in pregnant women, especially because of parasitic infections. Now, blood donor screening is another important thing that here at US we want to be very critical about, because the FDA does follow very, very strict guidelines, very, very strict guidelines, and they want to make sure that people are tested, of course, by an interview, if they have visited those areas where the disease is highly prevalent, or they have had this disease being diagnosed in the past, or they basically come from that high risk area, for example, recent travel to Sub-Sahara, and then again you come up with anemia. A recent travel to one of the countries in Africa, and where there's a very high incidence of a particular parasitic disease. These are some of the things that you want to keep in mind. And we're talking about disease. I'm sorry. Chagas disease, babesiosis, and malaria. These are the three important things, and there are others as well, but these are some of the most important things that if you want to donate blood, so you have to be careful that who is the donor, and he's properly screened for that. And most of the blood banks normally do that. Okay, then again, basically there's a there's a full criteria. It's not only based upon like did you visit such and such country last week or did you visit that country last year. So there is a list of the factors which are there, and they basically sometimes would exclude you to give blood for many years, like 3 years. If you have had malaria in the past 3 years, or you visited those areas where there is a high incidence of malaria, then basically the blood officer or the blood bank officer should defer you for at least 3 years. And want to make sure that that's not, because there's something called chronic malaria. This actually goes and lives in your liver and then recurs. So that recurrence may happen, and especially malaria is some of the diseases that cause typical for enlargement of spleen, enlargement of liver. Okay, as far as CDC listing for blood donations or blood banks is that they want to make sure that you are checked for American trypanosomiasis, babesiosis, Chagas disease, malaria. So these are some of the diseases that basically the same name for this one is just a reputation. It's just classified in ABC alphabetically. So these usually are diseases that you should be checked for before you donate blood. Travelers, there's another thing that you have to keep in mind, especially in parasitic infections, because if you travel to all those, unfortunately, those areas, they are tropical. That's where the major vacation spots are. So if you go to Hawaii or all those areas, you want to make sure that that's safe for you and you fulfill the criteria for international travels. I mean, there are kind of guidelines available. I think there's something called yellow card. So this card's available for international travelers. You can go and get it from the local city office or county office, and they have some people, they're going to advise you if you're going to travel, because there is a danger of parasitic infection, especially if you're on contaminated food and water. And then again, vector-borne transmission through person-to-person contact, and that includes all those fleas and all those little creatures that are there that can transmit that. So once you travel to those areas, so you want to make sure if there is any medicine available. For example, for malaria, there is a medicine available, so you have to take those usually on a daily basis, so that you can kind of protect yourself. And then again, for food and water, there are instructions. Boil water and so on and so forth. Okay. These are the commonest source of infection. The risk of acquiring these diseases basically vary from region of the world. And again, fecal oral route is important, because all those people who are working for you in the hotels or in restaurants, you want to make sure they are sanitized and properly cleansed. Otherwise, those people who are cooking food for you, they may basically pass this on to you via food. Now, again, contaminated food and water and vector-borne. These are some of the things that we think are important. More common, these are the list of the more common diseases that you may get if you have one of these parasites coming to you via food and water. And then less commonly, these three. As far as vector-borne, more common is malaria, leishmaniasis, and Chagas disease, and then less common is African sleeping sickness. That's one of the vector-borne diseases that people may have. Okay, animal-zoonotic diseases. These are diseases transmitted from animals, by definition called zoonotic diseases. These can be caused by parasites, and they usually present with a lot of different symptoms. Most common symptoms are, if it happens to be intestinal parasites, it's a diarrhea, muscle aches, and fevers. That's a typical presentation. If you are going through a process whereby you acquire these diseases, sometimes infected persons may experience symptoms that can be life-threatening. So these are some of the things. All these informations are available on CDC website. I would encourage you to go, I mean, just for your own interest, regardless of preparing for an exam, but these are important for things for you, and especially you can go and also find out the information or statistics for a particular country that you belong to or you plan to visit, and so on and so forth. Again, we talked about food, and they are, typically when we say food, we're talking about undercooked meat. So these are all these animals, people, they take their meat and then they can acquire different kind of diseases which are available. Again, I don't want to go in detail, but just want to give you an idea that there are consumption of meat of these animals, and then again, they are there to cause diseases. We talk about water resources, people working in farms, and then again, if you were to consume the food without proper washing, it's another thing. Many a times, I don't know whether you know it or not, if you go to food microbiology, you'll find out, I think I did mention that before as well, especially for banana, they are thiobendazole treated. Thiobendazole is anti-parasitic drug because they want to increase the shelf life of those fruits. Many a time they are picked at a very raw stage, and then of course they are coming from Haiti or wherever they're coming from, Chile, so there is a period they go through. They don't want them to contaminate, so they treat them. Right. Many times they say, well, wash your hands, wash your fruit, and because there always are dangers, not only of parasites, but the anti-parasite drugs as well. So you knowingly or unknowingly are consuming either of these two, the drugs or the parasites themselves. Was it a sigh or what happened? A deep sigh? Pets. Okay, again, there is a list of different parasites, dog and cat parasites, and there's a list of that. I'm not going to go in detail at all. I think I just want you to read a couple of these which are there commonly. The whole idea is especially ascaris and hookworm. These are like roundworm or hookworm infestations. So these are typically for those people who have domesticated dogs and cats, and I'm pretty sure that all of you do follow that. But of course, you can advise people and make sure that they are not suffering from those diseases that they basically may have acquired from their pets. How do you prevent? Well, again, for prevention of those zoonotic diseases, simple advice is that you want to make sure that your pet is under vet care and make sure that it's not going through parasitic infection. Then you have to make sure that you wash your hands, especially after touching animals, avoiding contact with animal feces, so on and so forth. And then again, also follow proper food handling procedure and contact with animals that are basically infected. And if you happen to work with a vet and like a veterinary pharmacist, of course, your chances of getting these infections will be higher, so you want to make sure that you are properly protected. Okay. Finally, food. Then there's a list of food contaminants that regulated by FDA. The most common, though, is Cryptosporidium, Giardia, Entamoeba histolytica, Trichinella, ascaris, and tapeworm. So these are some of the things. If you go back onto FDA, and you see like fresh food, vegetables, meat, these are the criteria. And actually I was reading the other day, last week as well, they have added some of the criteria in the meat. For example, hormones, let alone parasites. So there's a use of hormones in the meat. The level of antibiotics. So that's another thing, that they've been fed hormones, they've been fed antibiotics, and many other things are going on with the meat especially, and for fruits and vegetable as well. That's what the whole concept of this industry of organic thing came up. I don't know how far that is true, but there's a fear that people may have inherently, that they've been exposed to all these things knowingly or unknowingly. But of course, I mean, I'm not scaring you away, but I think as a intelligent person and as a health-related person, you should know what's going on, right? So obviously, these are some of the foodborne parasites the FDA does regulate. Transmission of food typically is undercooked fish, crabs, and mollusks, undercooked meat, so on and so forth, raw vegetables, and then again food contaminated by food service workers with poor hygiene and working in unsanitary facilities. So if downtown you're looking for a cheap restaurant, so you want to pay a price in terms of acquiring some of the parasites there. So there are some things we really have to be very, very careful. And I did actually notice myself as well that some of the things are not regulated by FDA. I mean, they are regulated in a way, but there's no way that they're going to test each and every crate, each and every bundle of every exogenous or anything that's coming from outside. So this is something that you really have to be careful. The advice is to wash this properly. Don't take the undercooked raw things, and take your chances. I mean, that's what it is. All right. Typical symptoms of foodborne parasitic infections are not different from an infection from bacteria or viruses. They are typically the same because the tissue doesn't really know who's causing the damage. Your tissues, they don't know. So basically, but what you need to do is that there is kind of a historical pattern or clinical features. The typical is history. For example, if you have been to those areas recently, a trip and so on and so forth, you come back, whole family is suffering from diarrhea, so of course there's something to investigate. Right? You can see a variety of symptoms: abdominal pain, diarrhea, muscle pain, neurological abnormalities as well, and then of course treatment is available once it's diagnosed. It's difficult to diagnose. I personally think especially U.S. physicians are not prepared. I mean, just imagine we are preparing you as a pharmacist and myself. I went myself in detail in parasitology, but I just limited 2 lectures for that. So that shows your kind of deficiency that may be there. That's why in some big hospital they have consultants of infectious diseases. And of course, for those of you who just raise their hand, they're going to go back to their countries. This is something that they want to study at their own, because it's very, very important. Right? Water-associated illnesses, again, the estimates are 360 million people visit recreational water, swimming pools, spas, lakes, so on and so forth. So the magnitude of the problem is enormous. And then again, there are parasitic infection. You're prone to parasitic infections if you go through all these kind of recreational water. And you can see from here, 7.4 million. That's what the CDC regulates, that there are things available. So this will give you a kind of complexity of the problems that we may go through once we deal with these parasitic infections. All right. And then again, diarrhea is most commonly presented, but it could be anything. It could be infections of any part, but mostly it's a diarrhea. And then again, you want to make sure that differential diagnosis is Shigella, E. coli, and viruses such as norovirus. This is again one of the very common questions asked, that if you were to differentiate a parasitic diarrhea from a bacterial diarrhea or viral diarrhea, what microorganism should you consider? Especially for recreational water, we consider Shigella, E. coli, especially this strain, and one virus which is norovirus. Bloodborne parasites, there are many, not though very common in this, they were not common in, let me change that phrase. They weren't common in this country, but now since we are having blood transfusion or sharing needle and intravenous drug users, so the incidence has gone up. That's another thing. AIDS and other kind of infectious diseases have increased the chances of bloodborne parasites. The most important, of course, is a malaria, but typically you can see the vectors. Basically, there are quite a few vectors. Again, for the answering your question as well, there are quite a few vectors which are available, and they actually have really put them in a broader kind of classification. They have a funny classification for that. They usually say like kissing bugs. So this one, the bugs are going to come and kiss you. So this is something they give it to you. It could be any of those parasites, any of those, bacteria or viruses which are there. And there's a list of that. You can see the most important are ticks, in some parts mosquitoes, sandflies, and the most important thing in US is, again, I purposely did not give you those statistics because they're very complicated. So Texas, Arizona, Florida, all these areas, upper part of Mexico, there are hundreds and tons of those areas where there's a very, very high incidence of those bloodborne parasites. But I think the most important thing you have to keep in mind, in US, the risk for vector-borne transmission is very low for all of the above parasite except for Babesia. So this is another species, Babesia, that's very common, and there are higher incidence of this disease. Okay. I think there's nothing there. Only thing you have to do is that keep in mind that, if you happen to go to those areas and those places where, and they are always warning. If you go to, for example, I remember when I was teaching you cholera, I did pull out some of the information for beaches in Hawaii, for example. They're going to give you all this detail. The recreational water, microorganism count, the pollen in the air, parasitic infection, incidence, and all these things. Many people, I assume, may not pay attention to these things, but paranoid as the physicians are and paranoid as any of the health professionals may be, they can go and pull out all those data which are available there. Okay, and that action I'll just end here. And I'll just pick up two more topics, I think, for Monday's lecture because they are important. And then as far as the questions coming from parasitology, I'll just limit myself to whatever information is available in whatever context in these two lectures and nothing more. The only thing I just want to emphasize, because many of you, I don't know, there's a communication gap, don't really pay attention and they keep on sending me email after an email. And all those lectures of general microbiology that are related to virology, mycology, and parasitology are included in this exam. Because you would not be able to understand pathogenesis of viruses, fungi, and parasites if you do not know that information which was presented to you as a part of general microbiology. Is it clear? No. It's not clear? In order for you to understand the pathogenesis, which is an objective of these three things, you have to go back and read those chapters, introductions to parasitic infections, introduction to fungal infection, introduction to viral infections. Right? So that's something that you will keep. They were actually taught in the beginning so that you have that thing in the mind is going to help you for this course. So they are not taught as a number of lectures, like they are not a part of 15 lectures, but it's there like implicit information that in order for you to understand the pathogenesis, you really have to have a good grasp of those basic concepts of immunology, concepts of general infections. Okay? Any questions? All right, thank you.